Alright, this is the final project for game 470. I'm going to split the video up into two separate ones, one going over the code and one actually viewing the scene because the recording software I'm using only allows for a 15-minute video. Okay, so I guess to begin, here's the model class, and so obviously there's pre-built models in here. So we have boxes, spheres, pyramids, for repeated texture. They all have normals in them. There's 6-face texture for different textures on each side. Repeating texture. And sphere. And so, again, all of them have normals. There's also flat plane. There's terrain model, which to get the normals on this, I averaged the 6 triangles that are around each vertex. And then there's also a skybox, which it's basically in a box where the faces face inward, or the normals face inward. I think that's it for all the models. So how this API works is obviously there's different HLSL files for each type of shader. And then there's a shader class for each of these files. So the shader classes are down here. So there's a base class, and then there's a shader for color, a shader for color light, a shader for texture, and a shader for texture light. And then for each of these, there's a corresponding graphic object. So a graphic object is basically a class that takes in a pointer to a shader and a pointer to a model. And basically the graphic object is basically a combination of a model and a shader. So again, for each shader, down here, there's a corresponding graphic object. So obviously one for texture, one for texture light, color, and color light. And then I also created a mirror graphic object. I guess I'll go into that right here. So in the constructor, it sets up all the different buffers for stenciling and the rasterizer. So it creates different stencil states. So it gets all this set up so that later on, when we're actually doing the rendering, we can switch from one blend state and stencil state. So basically switch states down here. But all these need to be set up. And then actually for the mirror, the rasterizer state needs to be passed in because that needs to be set up beforehand in the actual DX app. I guess we can move on to the actual DX app part now. So here is the initialization, and so it's a lot cleaner than it used to be. Basically in this function, we just create all the objects that we're going to use, all the textures, all the models, all the graphical objects, set up the lights, and the world matrices. So that's about it. So I'll walk you through here. So like first thing in the scene, it's going to be a skybox. So obviously it's using just a texture shader, and so then it takes in the skybox itself, takes in a pointer to the shader, and then the pointer to the actual texture. And then for the mirror, I'm actually doing color light shader for the mirror. And so here it takes in the color light shader and then model, which is just a flat plane. And then here's again, the pointer for the rasterizer state that we need to change later on. So I chose to, well, I guess I'll move on. So here's the shader. I'm setting up all the light parameters. So there's one directional, one spotlight, and then 3 point lights in the scene. So here's where all the information parameters are set up for this specific shader, and then we do that again for the texture light shader down below. And then here I'm setting up all the models for the scene. So in this scene right here, I chose to have individual graphic objects for each object in the game. Originally, I had one graphic object for, even though I might use the same model multiple times, I would use one graphical object and then set the world matrix in the draw stage. I thought that was a little messy, so instead, having a separate object for each of those in the draw stage, all you have to do is do a render call on that specific object, and that's it. There's no setting of world matrices, so I just thought that was a little cleaner than what I started out with. And so here, so obviously, all these 3 graphical objects are using the same model. So you can see they take the pointer in here, and they're obviously also using the same shader. And then obviously up here, you set the color for each of these, and then these are the 3 world matrices, so set those up here. And so then that's it for these. And then later in the draw stage, all you will have to do is do a render. And then obviously same thing here, this new shader that has texture and light. And then setting up a terrain model. And so these down here use the shader texture light. And then again, these 6 graphical objects are using the same model. And then obviously set texture. So this one here is actually a model that's loaded from a file. Previously, we had a pre-made unit sphere for the egg. But I found a model of a house online, and so I'm using that to sort of build a little village. And then again, it has a TGA texture associated with it. And it came with, obviously, everything in the file came with a texture map with UV coordinates, and so all of that is loaded in. And then setting each individual world matrix here. And again, the next model is also a file loaded one that I found online. And this one actually has it's fairly large, so this is probably the biggest impact on frame rate, is this model here. And again, here's where I set all the light parameters for this other texture. And so that's it right there for the initialization function. And so again, that's basically a lot of the setting up of all the vertex shaders and the buffers and everything are moved out of this function and then into the other classes. Okay, and then down here, here's the draw scene. So I do have a mirror, so we had to add this clear stencil up here in the clear depth stencil view. Otherwise, I noticed if you didn't have that there, the objects would render on the other side of the mirror as well as above it, so the reflected objects would also actually render beneath the mirror, which we obviously don't want that. So you have to add this in here. So we're setting up an eye position for the camera, and then for each individual shader, you have to send over the camera matrices. So unfortunately, there's no easy way to combine that to send them over once for all shaders, or at least I didn't figure out an easy way to do that. So again, the first thing that's rendered is the skybox right here. And so obviously set up texture, send the world, and then render. And then so I try to set up one texture at a time and then render all objects corresponding to it. And so this was the only one. This was the only one corresponding to just the texture shader. And so then obviously set up the shader light. I have a moving spotlight. So each time we run through draw, we change the direction of the spotlight. So that has to get updated every single time. So that's right here. And then again, then we have to send the light parameters along, and then all these objects can be rendered, and obviously each individual object, all you need to do is just call render on it, and which is a lot simpler than what we had before. So like I said, I am also adding a mirror. So you first want to render everything on that's going to be able to be reflected in the mirror first. So that's all these objects here, and then these 3 eggs here. The eggs are below because they're also using this shader colored light, as well as the mirror is also using that shader color light. And then obviously you have to reset up the spotlight because for this shader, because it obviously changed direction. Then in the mirror, so the first render, we set the blend state, and then the depth stencil here, and then we render the mirror. So this is basically just setting up which pixels we want to look at. So then later on, once we do the render on the other objects, we can do the depth stencil to line up the pixels corresponding to the mirror itself. And so then if there's an overlap in the stencil and the depth is far enough beneath the mirror, then we will use that image in the mirror itself later on when we do the second render pass through. All right, so that's his first mirror render. And so after that, here's all the reflected objects. And so to make life easier, I have an overloaded send light parameter and render function for all of these. So this second render function, it takes in the reflection matrix and then multiplies the reflection matrix by the graphic object's world, and it sends that over to the GPU. So makes it a little easier, so then you don't have to change the world matrix every time you go through draw. So you don't have to reset it earlier. You just set it initially and then use the specific render method based on if it's a reflection or if it's actual rendering. And so I did that both for the shaders to send the light over and for the objects or graphical objects. And I think that makes it a little bit cleaner, so then you're not setting the world matrix over and over again. And so again, then it's the second render on the mirror, and then I rendered the terrain shader afterwards. I'm going to stop this video here because I'm almost up on the 15 minutes, and then I'll continue on in the second part.